She stepped off the stagecoach into nothing. No husband waiting, no home in sight, just three bearded mountain men on horseback, and a letter in her hand that had promised her everything. The letter had lied about one thing, the most important thing. This is the story of Cordelia Pemberton and the winter of 1878 that changed her life forever. The stagecoach wheels groaned against frozen earth as they shuddered to a stop at Hollow Pine Crossing. Cordelia Pemberton pressed her gloved hand against the cold glass of the window and looked out at nothing. That was her first thought. Nothing. No church steeple, no rows of houses with smoke curling from chimneys, no husband standing with his hat in his hand waiting for her. Just a single weathered lean made of grey planks, a hand-painted sign with letters faded nearly to nothing by decades of mountain weather, and beyond all that the Bitterroot Range rising up like the shoulders of sleeping giants, covered in the first snow of October. The driver opened the door. Cold air poured in. Cordelia gathered her travelling coat around her shoulders and stepped down onto ground that felt harder than any street in Philadelphia had ever felt. Her boots crunched on frost. Her breath came out in white clouds. She was 22 years old and she had travelled 1,800 miles to arrive at nothing. Three men on horseback waited at the edge of the clearing. They sat still as carved wood. All three were tall, all three were bearded. All three wore the long canvas coats of men who worked outdoors in every season God sent. Behind them, the pine trees stood heavy with snow, and beyond the pines the mountain climbed into cloud. The letter in her reticule had promised a home. A man named S. Thornfield had written to her in a strong, steady hand about a valley protected on three sides by ridgeline, about a creek that never froze solid, about 80 head of cattle, and a cabin his father built the year before the war. The letter had spoken of hard work and fair dealing. The letter had not mentioned three men. The letter had lied about one thing, the most important thing. Before we go on tonight, if you are new here at this fire with me, take a moment to subscribe. I tell a new frontier story every week, stories of men and women who carved lives out of hard country, and I would be honored to have you ride along. And tell me in the comments, friend, where are you listening from tonight? What part of the country? What part of the world? Now, let us step back into the cold with Cordelia Pemberton and let us meet the three men who were about to change her life forever. The tallest of the three dismounted first. He moved with the unhurried economy of a man who had nothing to prove to anyone. His boots hit the ground, and he walked toward her with his hat held in one leather-gloved hand. His hair was dark, nearly black, cut short in the way of a man who did it himself with a straight razor every few weeks. His eyes, when he stopped in front of her, were the colour of old pewter, grey going on silver, steady. "Miss Pemberton," he said. His voice was low, unhurried. "I am Silas Thornfield. I wrote the letters." She tried to answer him. Her throat closed on the words. She had rehearsed what she would say during every mile of the train and every mile of the stagecoach, and now standing in front of this man who had put ink to paper and promised her a home, she could not remember one word of it. "I owe you the truth," Silas said, "before we take another step together. And the truth is something my letters did not tell you straight." Her stomach turned cold. The second man had dismounted now, a little slower, a little softer in the way he moved. His beard was lighter than Silas's, the colour of wheat stubble, and when he came to stand a respectful distance behind his brother, his eyes were a quiet blue. A pair of hands used to careful work. The third man stayed on his horse longer than the others. When he finally stepped down, he did it with a restlessness the other two did not have, and his eyes, dark amber like whiskey held to firelight, did not leave Cordelia's face. "I have two brothers," Silas said, "Jasper and Rowan. They live with me at the home place. I did not write that in the advertisement, and I did not write it in my letters because I thought there would be time to explain once you arrived. That was my mistake. You deserved to know before you ever stepped on a train." Cordelia's gloved fingers tightened on the cord of her reticule. She was aware of a roaring sound in her ears that had nothing to do with the wind. "Miss Pemberton," that was the second brother speaking now. "Jasper, His voice was gentler than Silas's, quieter. "What my brother is not saying well is this. Nobody here is proposing anything improper to you. Not one of us. We are ranchers. We are our mother's sons, and she raised us to respect women. You will have your own room. You will have a lock on your door. If by spring you wish to return east, we will pay your passage and say a prayer for you. That is all. That is the whole of it." The youngest Rowan said nothing, but he was watching her the way a man watches a flame he is not sure he should touch. The wind came down off the bitter root, and Cordelia felt it cut through every layer of wool she owned. She thought of her father, Thomas Pemberton, who had taught Latin at the Academy in Philadelphia for 30 years, and who had gone to sleep in his reading chair on an August afternoon and never opened his eyes again. She thought of the creditors who had come to the house within a week of the funeral. She thought of her Uncle Edmund in Baltimore, and the way his second wife's husband had watched her over the supper table, and how she had locked her door every single night in that house, and slept with a chair wedged under the handle. She thought of the newspaper clippings she had torn out of the Matrimonial Times. Strong woman needed. Mountain homestead. Hard life. Fair man. She lifted her chin. It was a small gesture, a gesture her father had always said was the only thing she did that reminded him of her mother, who had died the morning Cordelia was born. "Mr. Thornfield," she said, and her voice surprised her by not shaking. "I will come with you to your home. The rest we will speak of when I am warm." Silas nodded, just once, a short soldier's nod. He turned to his brothers and said something short and low that Cordelia could not hear, and then he turned back to her and held out his hand to help her onto a second horse that Rowan had brought up. She put her foot into the stirrup. Silas lifted her with almost no effort, as if she weighed nothing at all, and settled her behind him in the saddle. "Hold on to my coat, Miss Pemberton," he said. "The road up climbs steep. I do not want you falling." She put both gloved hands against the rough canvas at his sides and held on. The three men turned their horses toward the mountain, and they rode away from Hollow Pine Crossing into a country that did not belong to civilization at all. Let me tell you now, while they ride about the woman on the back of that horse, because you cannot understand what happened. On 3 Crowns Ranch in the winter of 1878, unless you understand why a young woman of gentle breeding from the city of Philadelphia would get on a train alone and put herself into the hands of strangers. Cordelia Pemberton was born the 2nd day of March, 1856, in a narrow brick house on Spruce Street. Her mother, whose name was Caroline, died in the birthing bed. Her father, Thomas, who taught Latin and sometimes Greek at a boys' academy not far from the house, raised her alone. He was not a warm man in the way some men are warm, but he was a true man, and he taught her everything he knew. She could read Virgil by the time she was 12. She could play 3 Chopin etudes on the piano her mother had loved. She could bake a plain bread and mend a sleeve and write a letter in a clean copperplate hand. She could not chop wood. She had never skinned an animal. She had never fired a weapon. She had never in her life been further west than Pittsburgh. In the August of 1878, her father fell asleep, reading Cicero in his leather chair by the window, and he did not wake up. The doctor said his heart had simply stopped. Cordelia buried him beside her mother in the old churchyard on a Thursday morning. By Monday, the creditors came. Her father, it turned out, had been borrowing for years to keep her in a decent school, to keep her in decent dresses, to keep her in the narrow brick house on Spruce Street. That was the only home she had ever known. The bank took the house. A man in a black coat took the piano. A man with a leather ledger took her mother's silver. By the end of the first week of September, she had 1 carpet bag, 1 rug-bundled cloak, her mother's cameo brooch, her father's Bible, and nowhere to sleep. Her Uncle Edmund wrote from Baltimore, "Come," he said, "and be a governess to my boy." Cordelia knew her Uncle Edmund. More importantly, she knew her Uncle Edmund's second wife, and she knew the man that woman had brought with her into the house, and she remembered how that man had looked at her across the Christmas table when she was 17. Cordelia Pemberton had read enough of the world to know when a house was not safe for a young woman alone. She walked instead to the office of the Matrimonial Times. She spent 2 of her remaining coins on a newspaper. She sat in a cold coffee shop and read every advertisement, and she found one that did not try to charm her. 3 brothers ranchers in Montana Territory seek one respectable Christian wife. Must be of strong character. Land is large, work is hard. Write S. Thornfield, Hollow Pine Crossing. She wrote that night. She wrote again the next week. She wrote for 4 months, and in 4 months, someone Thornfield, whoever he was, sent back letters in a strong, even hand that did not flatter her, did not flirt with her, did not promise her anything but honest dealing and a roof. The 4th letter contained a banknote for her passage and one more line. Come before October. Winter comes fast up here. That line was what she had read the most. That was the line she had folded and unfolded and folded again on the train. That was the line that made her trust a man she had never seen. Now she rode behind that man up a trail that was not a trail but only a narrowing of trees, and the country was so big that her mind could not hold all of it at once. The ride from Hollow Pine Crossing to the home place took the better part of 4 hours. The horses climbed through stands of ponderosa so tall the tops were hidden in cloud. They crossed a creek that ran black and cold between banks furred with frost. Once in a clearing, Cordelia saw a bull elk standing at the far end, his breath white in the cold air, and he lifted his great crowned head and watched them pass without fear. She had never seen a wild thing so large. She pressed her cheek just for a moment against the rough canvas of Silas Thornfield's coat, and she felt the steady working of his breathing under her hand. Silas spoke only a few times during the ride. He named the country as they passed through it the way a man names the rooms of his own house. That ridge there was called Old Man's Shoulder. That fall of water was called Widow's Comb. That meadow was where his father had shot his first elk when the family first came west in the year before the war. His father, Silas, told her, was Jedediah Thornfield out of Vermont, a carpenter by trade who had come west in 1857 looking for a country where a man did not have to bend his back to anyone. His mother was Charlotte Buchanan, a Scotswoman who came over from Glasgow as a girl and met Jedediah at a dance in St. Louis. They married within 2 months and never regretted it. They had 3 sons. They carved a home out of the bitterroot. His mother died of lung fever in the spring of '65, and it had broken Jedediah, though he never spoke of it. Jedediah himself was killed 8 years later when a horse fell on him crossing a spring-swollen creek. Silas had been 27, Jasper had been 25, Rowan had been 24, and the 3 of them had kept the ranch going alone for 5 years since. Why take a wife now? Cordelia heard herself ask, her voice small against the wind. Why this year? Silas was quiet for so long, she thought he had not heard her. Last December he finally said, my brother Rowan went out after a stray calf in a storm, and he did not come home that night. We found him the next afternoon 1/2 mile from the ranch, buried under a drift with his horse standing over him. He lived, but when his fever broke 3 days later, he asked me a question. He said, Silas, if I had died out there, who would have remembered me? And I did not have an answer for him. That was when I knew that 3 brothers alone on a mountain is not a family. That is just 3 men waiting to die. Cordelia did not say anything. The wind answered for her, sighing through the pines. They came out of the last of the timber just as the sun was starting to go down behind the western ridge. Cordelia caught her breath. The valley lay below them like something out of a painting, a long cabin of squared logs with smoke rising from a stone chimney. A barn twice the size of the cabin, fenced pasture stretching 1/2 mile to the creek, and in the pasture cattle standing shoulder deep in dry grass. A smaller outbuilding she guessed was a smokehouse, a kitchen garden behind the main house, already cut back for winter. 2 dogs came bounding up the road to meet them, one black and one brindled, barking their welcome. The whole valley was bathed in the late gold light of a mountain sundown, and for one long moment Cordelia forgot that she was cold, and that she was tired, and that her life had changed past recognizing. She just looked. This is the home place, Silas said. 3 Crowns Ranch. You are welcome here, Miss Pemberton. That evening Jasper cooked. Cordelia was surprised. She had somehow assumed that a household of 3 men on a mountain would eat salt pork and biscuit and nothing else. But Jasper served her a thick stew of venison and turnips and dried thyme and a loaf of dark bread still warm from the Dutch oven. He served it on pewter plates that had been his mother's, he said, quietly, and he had unwrapped them from their flannel only that morning. Silas sat at the head of the long pine table. Cordelia was placed at his right hand. Rowan took the seat across from her, and after a moment she understood that he had chosen that seat because from it he could watch the door. It was a habit she would come to recognize in him. He was the one who listened for things nobody else could hear. After the plates were cleared, Silas looked at her across the table and said what he had come to say. Miss Pemberton, this is the arrangement. You will sleep in the large room upstairs. That was our mother and father's room. It has a lock on the door and the key is yours. I will sleep on the settle beside the hearth. Jasper and Rowan share the small room behind the kitchen, as they always have. No man in this house will come through your door without your leave. Not tonight, not ever. He paused to let her hear that. She nodded. You will keep the kitchen and the house. Jasper will teach you what you do not yet know. We 3 will run the cattle hunt, cut wood, tend the stock. You will work because work is the only honest currency on this mountain. Come March, when the pass opens, if you wish to return east, I will put you on the stage at Hollow Pine myself and pay your fare to Philadelphia or anywhere else you ask. You owe me nothing for that. You owe nobody in this house anything for that. He put his hands flat on the table. His eyes grey, going on silver, did not waver. If you choose to stay, and if in time you choose to marry one of us, that is your choice. Not ours. We 3 have an agreement between us. We do not share a woman. Whichever of my brothers or myself you might choose, the other 2 will be your brothers for the rest of your life. And God help anyone who ever forgets it. That is the whole of it. That is the promise of this house. Cordelia looked at each of them in turn. Silas the mountain, Jasper the quiet water, Rowan the burning coal. She thought of her father and the thing he used to say. When life gives you 2 bad choices, daughter, always take the road with honor on it. I understand, she said, and then because she felt she owed these men at least the truth back, she added, I will need time. I have not come here to choose in a week or in a month. I have come here to learn what this country is and what you are and what I am when I am not in the city I was born in. If that is acceptable to you, then I will stay. Miss Pemberton, said Silas, that is exactly what I hoped you would say. Rowan, who had not spoken since the crossing, stood up from the table. He crossed to the fire bent and added a split of pine. He did not look at her when he said it. Welcome to the home place, Miss Pemberton. It was the first thing he had said to her. She realized, sitting there in the warm kitchen with the wind rising outside, that his voice was deeper than she had expected, and it shook just a little at the end of her name. That night, Silas himself carried her carpet bag up the narrow stair to the large bedroom at the end of the hall. He set it just inside the door. He pointed out the iron key in the lock. He pointed out the oil lamp on the bureau and the copper pitcher of fresh water on the washstand. He pointed out the little hearth and the small stack of split pine beside it, already laid, already ready to light. If you need anything in the night, Miss Pemberton called down the stairs. Someone will be awake. She looked at him in the lamplight. His face was not a handsome face by the standards of Philadelphia. It was too weathered, too marked. But it was a face she could trust. She knew that already. Mr. Thornfield, she said. Thank you. He nodded. He closed the door between them. She heard his boots go down the stair. She stood for a long moment in the middle of that strange, quiet room. Then she crossed to the hearth, knelt on the braided rug and struck the lucifer match against the stones. The fire caught. The light grew. She saw the room then in proper light for the first time. A 4-poster bed of dark carved wood with a quilt upon it, worked in the log cabin pattern in colours that must once have been bright and were now faded to softness. A wardrobe of pine, a bureau with a cracked mirror, a single straight-backed chair, and above the bed a framed daguerreotype of a man and a woman on their wedding day. The man stern and still, the woman soft as smiling faintly. Jedediah and Charlotte Thornfield. She was sleeping tonight in their bed. Cordelia Pemberton sat down on the edge of that bed, and for the first time since her father had died, she put her face in her hands and she wept. She wept for Thomas Pemberton and the Latin books nobody had bought. She wept for her mother's silver that had gone to pay a banker's ledger. She wept for the piano. She wept for the Spruce Street house. She wept for the 22 years that had been hers before today. And then she dried her eyes. She got up. She turned the iron key in the lock of her own free will, not from fear, but from respect for the men who had given her that key. And she lay down on Charlotte Thornfield's quilt, and she slept better than she had slept in 2 months. The first week at 3 Crowns was the hardest week of Cordelia Pemberton's life, and she would later say many years afterward, when her hair had gone silver at the temples, that it was also the week when she first became a woman in the full meaning of that word. Jasper rose with her before dawn the first morning and walked her through the kitchen the way a man walks a stranger through his mother's house. This is the flour barrel. This is the salt. This is the sourdough start, which had been his mother's and had been kept alive in its crock for more than 20 years. This is the smokehouse. This is the root cellar. This is the spring house. He taught her the bread. He taught her the churn. He taught her the way the wood stove drew and the way it sulked, and which split of kindling to use for what. He never raised his voice. He never once said she should know these things by now. When she let the first loaf burn, he quietly took it from the oven, set it to cool, cut away the black, and said, "We will feed the chickens with the burnt part. They do not mind." Silas taught her the land. He took her up on the back of his horse on the second afternoon, and he rode her out to the north fence line, and he named the country to her again, the way he had named it on the way up the mountain, but this time more carefully, as if he were showing her something that might soon belong to her. That meadow, he told her, is where we carve in the spring. That stand of aspens is where the deer bed down at dawn. That break in the ridge is the weather break. When the wind comes through that break, you have 6 hours before the storm is here. 6 hours to get the stock in. How do you know? 6 hours, she asked. My father told me, said Silas. His father told him. It does not fail. On the 4th day, she tried to chop wood. She had been watching them all week, the way the axe came down and the wood fell apart like it was glad to, and she had thought to herself that surely she could do this. She had waited until all 3 of them were at the south end of the pasture, and she had taken the felling axe from the block and stood a round of pine on end and raised the axe over her shoulder the way she had seen Rowan do. It went wrong almost at once. The axe was heavier than she had expected. The round of pine was not as steady as it had looked. She brought the axe down, and the head turned and it glanced off the pine and drove down hard, and she would later realize, turning the moment over and over in her mind, that it had missed her left boot by less than 2 inches. She stood there with the axe stuck in the chopping block and her hands shaking and her breath coming fast. He was behind her before she knew he had come. She had not heard him cross the yard. She would never in all the years she knew him hear Rowan Thornfield cross a yard. He moved like the thing he most resembled, which was a cat. Miss Pemberton. She turned. His face was carved and unsmiling. His dark amber eyes had something burning in them, and she did not know yet whether it was anger or fear. You almost took your own foot off, he said. I know. Do not. He said, do that again without me. She nodded. She thought he was going to turn and leave her there in her shame. Instead, he walked around her, pulled the axe out of the block and held it out handle first. Put your hands there and there. Wider. No. Wider than that. Your feet set them further apart. Weight on the back foot until the swing. Now shoulders loose. Shoulders. Miss Pemberton, not arms. The axe does the work. You are only showing it where to fall. He stepped behind her. He did not touch her. He stood close enough that she could feel the heat of him at her back, and he talked her through the swing. And when she brought the axe down this time, it struck the round clean, and the pine split apart in 2 pale halves with a crack, like a rifle shot in the cold air. She turned around in pure delighted surprise. He was still standing very close. For one beat of her heart, neither of them moved. Then Rowan Thornfield took 3 steps back, quick and deliberate, and he said in a voice that was not quite steady, "You learn fast, Miss Pemberton." And then he walked away from her across the yard, and he did not look back. That night in her room with the door locked and the fire low, Cordelia wrote in the little journal she had brought from Philadelphia. She wrote a single line. "Silas is a wall of stone. Jasper is a quiet garden. Rowan is a storm waiting to break. I do not know which of them I will choose. I do not know if I will choose any of them. I only know that I am not the woman I was 8 days ago." She did not know it yet, but that was the moment when the first seed of something was planted. She would not see the shape of it for weeks. None of them would. On the 7th morning, she was hanging the washing on a line Silas had strung between 2 pines at the side of the house when she saw it. She had thought at first it was only a fold of ground beyond the last outbuilding, but when she walked closer carrying her basket, she realized it was a fenced square. A small white painted fence with 3 stones inside it. 3 stones. She stopped at the gate of the little enclosure. She did not open it at first. She only read from where she stood what was carved into the fronts. Jedediah Thornfield, 1820 to 1873. Charlotte Thornfield, 1828 to 1865. Beloved of God. And then at the end, newer than the other 2, the stone still pale, the carving still sharp. Millicent Ashby, 1856 to 1876. She came to these mountains with hope. Cordelia set down the basket of washing very slowly. Her hands were suddenly cold again, cold the way they had been at Hollow Pine Crossing 8 days ago. She was still standing there at the little fence when Silas Thornfield came up behind her, not softly the way Rowan would have, but openly, his boots steady on the frozen grass so that she would hear him come. He stopped beside her. He looked at the 3 stones. He looked at the newest one longest. "You deserve to know," he said. The wind came down off the ridge. It moved in the pines behind them. It was the only sound in the world for a long breath. Her name was Millicent Ashby, Silas said. She was 20 years old. She came up this mountain the way you came up this mountain, except it was December and the pass was already closing. I had written for a wife. I thought back then that I wanted one wife for the house, the way my father had wanted my mother. I did not yet understand that this is a house of 3 men, and that a woman who comes into it must know that from the beginning. I did not tell her about Jasper and Rowan in my letters. She arrived and she saw 3 men, and she decided on the first night, I think, that she had come to a den of wolves. Cordelia did not speak. I did not handle it well, Miss Pemberton. I was angry. I had ridden 4 hours to meet her stage in a snowstorm, and she would not even sit at table with us. On the 3rd morning, I lost my temper with her. I said words to her that I will regret until the day they put me in the ground. That night she left the house. She took no horse. She took no coat. She walked off the porch in her nightdress and her travelling shoes, and she walked into the storm. His voice did not break. It got quieter. It got level the way a river gets level just before a fall. We found her 3 days later, about a half mile up toward the ridge where the wind piles the drifts. She had sat down against a pine, Miss Pemberton. She had gone to sleep. It was a gentle way for her to go, and for that I thank God, but it was not the way she should have gone. She should have grown old. She should have had children. She should not have died because I was too proud to say to her in plain words what I have said to you in plain words. He stopped. He looked at the stone. I did not write for another wife after Millicent. I told Jasper and Rowan the house would stay as it was, but then last December Rowan almost died in that storm, and when he lived through it he asked me the question I told you about on the ride up, and I understood then that I owed my brothers more than my grief. I owed them a chance at a family, and I owed the next woman who came up this mountain the truth from the first letter, which is what I tried to do with you, except that I still did not tell you everything, and I have been hating myself for that since you stepped off the stage at Hollow Pine. He stopped talking. Cordelia realized that he was waiting, not for forgiveness, not for comfort, only to see what she would do. She did not speak for a long time. She was thinking of a young woman who had sat down under a tree in a storm because she had been afraid of 3 men she did not know. She was thinking of how easily she could have been that young woman. She was thinking too of a detail she had collected in the last 8 days without meaning to, of Jasper quietly setting aside the burnt bread for the chickens, of Rowan stepping back 3 paces once he had put the axe in her hands so as not to stand too close, of Silas giving her the only iron key to a room that had been his parents'. She bent down, she picked up the basket of washing, she set it at her feet. She walked through the gate of the little enclosure, and she knelt on the hard ground beside the newest of the 3 stones, and she laid one small wild aster, the last one she had found blooming at the base of the fence post that morning, on the bare earth in front of it. Then she stood up, and she turned to Silas Thornfield, and she said, "Mr. Thornfield, thank you for telling me. I am not going anywhere." She saw it then, the thing that moved in the grey going on silver of his eyes. It was very small and it was very quick, and if she had been the woman she had been 2 weeks ago in Philadelphia, she would have missed it entirely. But she was not that woman anymore. That night when Silas brought her an armload of split pine for her bedroom hearth, as he had done every night that week, he stood in her doorway a moment longer than he had stood there on any of the nights before, and he said something she would come to hear again in that same voice at every important turning of her life. "Sleep well, Miss Pemberton. You are safe here. This is where you belong, at least until you decide whether that is true." She closed the door, she turned the iron key, she stood a moment with her hand flat against the wood. Outside, very soft, the first real snow of the season began to fall on 3 Crowns Ranch. 18 miles away in the little office above his bank at the edge of the town that would one day be called Silver Creek, a man named Ezra Blackwood was folding a letter that had come that afternoon from Baltimore. He was reading it for the 3rd time. He was smiling, a small, slow smile, and he was already thinking about how a letter like the one in his hand could be used to take from 3 mountain brothers the one thing they had not known they were about to love. But Cordelia Pemberton, who was 22 years old and who had just chosen to stay, did not yet know any of that. She only knew that she had stopped being afraid of the dark outside her window. She blew out the lamp. She lay down on Charlotte Thornfield's wedding quilt, and high up on the shoulder of the bitter root, in a house that had been waiting 5 years for the sound of a woman's breathing. In it at night, 4 people slept under the same roof, and the snow came down, and the winter that would change every one of them forever began. The first real snow came down through the night, and by morning the valley had been remade. Cordelia Pemberton stood at the kitchen window with a tin cup of coffee in both hands and looked out at a world that had been silenced. The fence posts were capped in white. The barn roof was white. The pines on the far slope were bent under their new weight. The creek she could just see from where she stood ran black between banks that had gone soft and rounded overnight. Smoke rose from the smokehouse chimney in a thin, straight line. It was the first morning of November, 1878, and Cordelia understood standing at that window that the country she had come into was about to show her a face it had not yet shown. Jasper was already at the stove behind her. He did not need to ask whether she had slept. He only set a plate down on the pine table and said, quiet as he always was, "Eat first, Miss Pemberton. Work after." She turned from the window. She sat. She ate. Over the next 3 weeks, she learned more than she had learned in the first 7 years of her schooling. She learned Jasper's kitchen. She learned the difference between elk fat and bear fat, and why you rendered them separately. She learned to judge the draw of the stove by the sound of the fire alone without opening the door. She learned the way Jasper kept the sourdough start in a crock wrapped in a flannel that had once been his mother's apron, and how he fed it each evening with a spoonful of flour and a whisper of warm water, and how he called it a living thing, which he said it was. One afternoon, he took down the violin. It was hanging on the wall above the hearth in a leather case so old the stamping on it had gone dim. Cordelia had noticed it on the first night and had not asked about it because there was something in the way the 3 brothers looked past it, the way a family looks past a door that is kept closed, that had told her not to ask. But on that afternoon, with the wind beginning to rise outside and a pot of venison stew simmering low on the stove, Jasper stood up from his chair by the fire, and he took the case down and he opened it on the table. The violin inside was beautiful, a warm dark red colour, the colour of old cherry wood with a faint scar across the back where something had once struck it and been repaired. Jasper lifted it out the way a man lifts a child. This was my mother's, he said. Her father brought it from Glasgow. He gave it to her the year she married my father. She taught all three of us to play on it, but only I ever cared enough to keep at it. He tightened the bow. He rosigned it. He set the violin under his chin, and he drew a long first note that made Cordelia lift her coffee cup halfway to her mouth and forget to drink. He played a slow air she did not know. It was a song from a country neither of them had ever seen, a song that was older than the Bitterroot Range itself, and Jasper Thornfield played it in that mountain kitchen with his eyes half closed and his wheat-coloured beard tilted toward the fire. And Cordelia Pemberton sat with her coffee going cold in her hands and felt something inside her chest loosen that she had not known was tight. When he finished, he set the violin back in its case as carefully as he had lifted it out. I do not play often, he said. Why not? He was quiet a moment. He closed the lid of the case. He ran one long, careful finger along the edge of it. I was meant to be married, he said, 4 years ago, to a girl named Winifred Hale from over Bozeman Way, schoolteacher's daughter. We had set the date for the 14th of May, 1874. She took the smallpox in the first week of that April. She died on the 8th day of it, 3 weeks and 1 day before our wedding. He closed the case. He set it back on its peg above the hearth. The violin sat in the case for the better part of a year after. I could not bear the sound of it. I still do not play much. Only when the house needs it, Miss Pemberton. Only when the house feels empty in a way music can fix. He looked at her, his quiet blue eyes steady on hers. It did not feel empty this afternoon. I wanted you to know that. She did not have words ready for him. She only nodded. She would remember the look of him standing there by the hearth, one hand still resting on the case, for the rest of her life. Silas was teaching her the ranch in a different way. On the cold mornings he took her out on horseback to check the fence lines, and he spoke to her about the land the way some men speak of their children. That grove is where we lost 40 head in the hard winter of '71. That spring has never once frozen over in my memory, and if it ever does, the mountain is done with us. That cut up there, you see, where the pines thin is, where my father took an elk the day my mother went into labour with me, and the two things happened within the hour of each other, so he always said I was born on the back of an elk. One morning, in the middle of November, while they rode a high pasture together, and the sun was striking the snow off the top of the ridge in little bright flares, Cordelia asked him about his scar. It ran across his left temple, a pale clean line about 2 inches long, lost for most of its length in the dark of his hair. She had been noticing it for 2 weeks. She had not yet felt she had the right to ask. Silas touched it with 2 gloved fingers, the way a man touches a thing he has forgotten is there. Wilderness, he said, May of '64. I was 18 years old. I had gone into the Army of the Potomac that February because my father said the Union needed men, and a Thornfield did not sit by when a country was on fire. My mother wept. My father nodded. I went. The horses walked on. Cordelia did not interrupt him. She had learned in 3 weeks that Silas Thornfield was a man you did not hurry. The wilderness was a bad place, Miss Pemberton. The woods caught fire around us. There were men I could not get to. A piece of shell came past me and took off the side of my hat and part of my scalp with it. I went down. I was fortunate. A corporal from Ohio pulled me out before the fire came through that stretch. I do not remember his name. I have been meaning to remember his name for 14 years. He was quiet a long minute. I do not speak much, Miss Pemberton, because of that place. A man who has seen what men can do to one another on a field like that does not carry it out into polite speech afterward. He carries it inside him. He keeps it there. The mountain does not ask him to explain. He turned his grey-going on silver eyes on her. I tell you only so you know why I am what I am. It is not coldness. It is quiet. There is a difference. I know the difference, Mr. Thornfield, Cordelia said. He nodded once. He turned his horse toward home. Rowan was the slowest of the three to let her close. He was gone before dawn most days, out with his rifle and his long-legged black horse, and he came back after dark with something across the saddle, a deer, a wild turkey, once a cougar that he laid across the porch and skinned, in the yellow lantern light without a word. He ate at the table with them. He said please and thank you. He asked her twice a week with careful formality whether there was anything she needed him to bring back from the high country. But he did not linger in the kitchen the way Jasper did. He did not ride out with her the way Silas did. He kept, she thought, a careful distance from her, and she did not know at first whether it was a kind of indifference or a kind of something else entirely. She found out on a Wednesday afternoon. She had gone out to the chicken coop to collect eggs. It was a still grey day with no wind, the kind of day on the bitter root that always meant weather was coming in behind it. She had her basket on one hip. She was crossing the yard back toward the kitchen door when she saw Rowan at the edge of the barn, bent over working on something. She went to him because the small sociable habits of a household had begun to form in her by then, and she wanted to offer him coffee. He was cleaning a deep cut on his own forearm. He had his sleeve rolled back to the elbow. He had a tin basin of steaming water on the chopping block beside him. He had a needle and a length of silk thread set out on a folded clean handkerchief. He was working the wound with a cloth, slow and methodical, his face set, and he did not see her until she was almost at his shoulder. He flinched, not from pain, from being seen. Miss Pemberton, Mr. Thornfield, how did this happen? Branch came back on me in the cedars. My own carelessness. I will have it sewn up in 10 minutes. You do not need to see this. I have a steady hand, she said, and she surprised herself with the evenness of her own voice. And better light inside. Come into the kitchen. He hesitated. For the first time since she had met him, she saw him without the armour on, only a man with a hurt arm and the wish not to trouble anybody about it. Then he nodded once and followed her inside. She sat him at the table. She cleaned the cut with the steaming water. She threaded the silk onto the curved needle. Jasper had shown her only a few days before how to close a small wound on one of the dogs. She had not known then that she would use the lesson on a man. She took a breath. She set the needle. Rowan did not flinch. He sat with his arm flat on the pine, and he watched her face, not the wound, and he did not speak until she had set the last stitch and tied it off neatly the way Jasper had shown her. Where did you learn that, Miss Pemberton? Your brother. 2 days ago, on a dog. He made a sound low in his throat that might almost have been a laugh. Well then, he said, apparently I am the dog. She laughed. She did not mean to. It came out small and surprised, and it surprised him too. And for one short breath they looked at each other across the table, and Cordelia understood clearly and for the first time that Rowan Thornfield was afraid of her. Not of her in the usual way. He was afraid of what she might make him feel. He pulled his sleeve down. He stood up. He thanked her with the same careful formality with which he thanked her for coffee, and he went out to the barn, and she did not see him again until supper. That night she wrote in her journal 2 lines instead of 1. Rowan stepped back today. He stepped back because he had stepped too near. A man who steps back out of respect is a man who knows himself. I have never met a man like that before. The storm came on the 12th of November. They all felt it coming. By dawn the wind had shifted into the break in the ridge that Silas had showed her in October, and he came in from the porch with frost in his beard and said, calm and plain, 6 hours, maybe 5. The next 5 hours were the hardest physical work of Cordelia's life. She did not do the heavy work. The brothers did. But she ran what must be run. She carried buckets. She stoked the stove. She hauled wood inside and stacked it by every hearth until there was no place left to stack. She drove the chickens in. She carried grain. She filled every vessel in the house with water from the well before the well froze. By the time the first hard gusts came down off the ridge, she was wringing wet inside her wool and could barely feel her fingers. But she had done what she had been told to do, and when Silas came stamping back into the kitchen, with snow already in his eyebrows, he looked around once at the ready house, and he said only, well done, Miss Pemberton, and that sentence warmed her more than the stove did. The storm held them for 3 days. On the second day, Silas understood sometime between one meal and the next that the 30 head of cattle in the far east pasture had not been brought in before the storm closed down. He had thought they were already at the near pasture. He had been wrong. 30 head in this storm would freeze standing. 30 head was the cash that paid the spring taxes. 30 head was the year. He put on his heaviest coat without a word and started for the door. "You are not going alone," Rowan said, already reaching for his own coat. "No," said Silas. "I'm not asking you to come." "You are not asking," said Rowan. "I am telling." Jasper stood up from the fire. "I will stay with Miss Pemberton." And Cordelia heard herself say in a voice that did not tremble at all, "Mr. Thornfield, if you ride out alone in this, and you do not come back, I will not stay in this house. I will go back to Philadelphia, and I will tell every person I ever meet that the Thornfield brothers were fools who died because they would not listen to a woman." The room went still. Jasper made a sound that was almost a laugh. Rowan's mouth opened slightly, and Silas Thornfield, who had not smiled in all the weeks she had known him, smiled at her. It was a small, tired smile. It did not last long, but she saw it. "Very well, Miss Pemberton. Rowan rides with me. Jasper stays with you. We will be back before the worst of it." They left at first light. The wind took them the moment they cleared the barn. They were not back by evening. They were not back by full dark. Cordelia and Jasper sat up in the kitchen with the big lamp burning and the coffee pot never off the stove. Jasper played his mother's violin quietly, not for pleasure now, but because he needed to do something with his hands besides drum them on the table. Cordelia listened. She did not speak. Once she crossed to the window and she pressed her hand against the glass, and she said out loud to a God she had mostly stopped speaking to since her father had died, "Please." It was nearly 2 in the morning when Silas came through the door. He came through sideways. He was carrying Rowan in his arms. Rowan was not moving. His face was grey. There was black frozen blood along the line of his temple where he had gone down under his horse. Silas's own right hand was frozen white inside the glove he could not get off. Jasper said Silas in a voice with no breath behind it. The boy's hurt. "Miss Pemberton, I am going to need you." She did not think. She acted. She later would say that was the night she stopped being a young lady from Philadelphia and became, in the only way that mattered, a woman of the Bitterroot. Jasper and she worked through the rest of that night and into the next morning. They thawed Silas's right hand slowly in water that they warmed one careful degree at a time. They washed and closed the gash on Rowan's temple. They packed snow carefully around his fevered body to bring the temperature down where it needed to come down. Jasper held his brother's head. Cordelia, under Jasper's quiet direction, threaded the needle again and set the 4 stitches Rowan's temple required, and she did not let her hand shake once, even when Rowan, deep in the dark place he had gone, murmured the name of his dead mother and then went quiet again. By the noon of that next day, the worst of it had passed. Silas was sitting at the fire with his hand wrapped in wool soaked in tallow. Rowan was in his bed behind the kitchen, sleeping the heavy, clean sleep of a body that has chosen, after all, to live. Jasper was at the stove warming broth. The storm outside had dropped. The cattle, 27 of the 30, were in the near pasture where Silas and Rowan had driven them through the dark before Rowan's horse had gone down. 3 were lost. 27 were saved. The year was saved. Silas looked up at her from his chair at the hearth. His eyes were rimmed red with exhaustion and cold. He said, slow and careful, with the words, "Miss Pemberton, I do not know what I have done to deserve the way you rose to this house last night, but I know I will spend the rest of whatever time is given me trying to be worthy of it." She did not trust her own voice. She only put her hand for one short moment on his uninjured shoulder. Then she went back to the stove to help Jasper with the broth. Rowan's fever broke the 3rd night. She had been sitting with him because Jasper needed sleep, and Silas's hand would not let him change a cold cloth without pain. She had a book in her lap that she was not reading. She had her hand on Rowan's hand on top of the quilt lightly, just to know the heat of it, and she had felt over the last hour the heat start to fall. Around 3 in the morning, his eyes opened. They were clear. He looked at her. He looked at his own hand under hers. He looked at her face again. "Miss Pemberton," he said. His voice was a ruin. "You've been sitting here a long time. Yes, you should sleep." "I will." In a moment, he closed his eyes again. She thought he had gone back under. She began carefully to move her hand off his. His fingers closed on hers. Weak. "But there. Stay," he said. "Just until the lamp burns down." She stayed. The lamp burned down. By the time it guttered, he was truly asleep, the clean sleep now, and his fingers had relaxed around hers. She laid his hand back on the quilt. She stood up. She looked down at him in the almost dark, at his dark hair matted with sweat and the white edge of the bandage across his temple, and she felt something move in her chest that she was not ready to name yet. She went to her own room. She did not write in her journal that night. There were no words in her yet for what she was feeling. Winter settled in hard after that storm. The valley did not see the ground again for 4 months. The days took a shape. Breakfast before dawn, work through the cold hours, dinner at midday, work again until the light failed, supper by lamplight around the pine table, then the long mountain evenings. Those evenings were what changed them. They sat around the hearth after supper, the way families had sat around fires since the first fire was ever built. Silas would mend a harness or oil a gun. Jasper would read or sometimes play the violin, now quieter pieces that did not frighten the dogs. Rowan would whittle. She had noticed him one evening, working a small piece of pine with a knife, and she had not asked what it was, and he had not offered. Cordelia herself would sew or darn a sock, or read aloud from one of the 4 books that Silas had, which were a Bible, a volume of Shakespeare, a frontier almanac, and a much-worn copy of a novel by a woman named Austen that had belonged to his mother. She read the Austen aloud 3 evenings a week, and by Christmas all 3 brothers could predict the next line, and Rowan, to his own quiet astonishment, had developed strong opinions about Mr. Darcy. Silas began to call her Cordelia, somewhere in the middle of December. He did it the first time without warning in the middle of a sentence about salt, and she did not correct him, and by the next night all 3 of them called her Cordelia. She called Silas by his first name once carefully on the evening of the 22nd of December, and he looked up from his harness, and he smiled small and tired, as he always smiled, and he said, "That is good to hear in this house, Cordelia. Thank you." On the morning of the 24th of December, 2 riders came down the trail into 3 Crowns. One was a young man from a ranch 8 miles south. His family was called Harrison. He had ridden up to ask if 3 Crowns could spare a half bushel of seed oats, because his father had taken a fall off a ladder and was going to be laid up until after the new year, and their supplies were short. He was a good open-faced boy of maybe 19, and Silas said of course, and told Jasper to put up the sack. The second rider was not a neighbour. He rode in on a gelded bay that had not been bred in any mountain valley Cordelia had ever heard of. He wore a long black coat with an astrakhan collar and a beaver hat, so new it had probably come out of a Chicago shop that same autumn. He rode up to the porch, and he did not dismount, and he tipped his hat to Cordelia, who had come out onto the steps with her shawl around her shoulders, and he smiled a small, slow smile that did not reach his eyes. "Miss Pemberton, I believe. Good morning to you." She had never in her life seen this man. He knew her name. Silas came up beside her. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice, but something in the way he set his boots on the porch made Cordelia think of the way a dog sets its stance before it decides whether to growl. "Mr. Blackwood, Mr. Thornfield, Merry Christmas, say your business." Ezra Blackwood reached into his inner coat. He produced a folded letter. He leaned from the saddle and held it out. "This came through my bank from Baltimore, sir. I thought out of Christian courtesy I would bring it up the mountain myself. I believe it concerns the young lady on your porch." Silas did not take the letter. Cordelia did. She opened it with fingers that she would not allow to shake. She read it once. She read it again. It was written in a hand she had not seen in 4 years but still recognized. Her uncle's hand. The letter stated in the flat, careful language of a man who had hired a lawyer to help him that Cordelia Pemberton had been promised in marriage from the age of 15 to her cousin Reginald Pemberton of Baltimore. The letter stated that any other marriage contract into which she had entered or might be persuaded to enter was therefore void under family law. The letter stated that Ezra Blackwood, as a representative of the family's legal interests in the Western Territories, was authorized to convey Miss Pemberton back to Baltimore at her earliest convenience. The letter stated finally and warmly that her Uncle Edmund prayed nightly for her safe return to the bosom of her family. Cordelia looked up from the letter. Her face felt very cold. She did not have a cousin named Reginald. Her Uncle Edmund had one son, 12 years old, named Peter. There had never in her life been any talk of any engagement to anyone. The letter was a lie. She folded it. She looked at Ezra Blackwood, who was still smiling down from his horse. She looked at his small, neat beard and his black coat and his new beaver hat. She looked at the eyes that did not smile when the mouth did. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, and her voice was steady in a way that surprised even her, "this letter is not true. Miss Pemberton, I understand the mountain air can confuse a young lady from the city. Let me assure you that this document was notarized by Judge Horace Thurgood in our town, and that your uncle's signature on it is authentic. I have arranged passage for you on the 8th of January stage. I will return that morning to escort you." "I am not going with you on the 8th of January, Mr. Blackwood. I am not going with you at all." Blackwood's smile did not move, but something moved behind his eyes. "Miss Pemberton, I understand sentiment. I truly do. But permit me one further observation, and I will leave these good gentlemen to their holiday. I have acquired within the last 10 days a certain outstanding tax lien against the property known as 3 Crowns Ranch. The amount is $280 owed to the territory of Montana. The balance comes due on the 15th of March. If the balance is paid on that day, there is of course no issue. If the balance is not paid, the property reverts to the lien holder, which as of last Tuesday is myself." He touched the brim of his new hat. "A Merry Christmas to all of you. Miss Pemberton, I do hope you will reconsider. Your family misses you." He turned his horse. He rode back up the trail. The 3 brothers and Cordelia Pemberton stood on the porch of 3 Crowns Ranch and watched him go, and not one of them spoke until the sound of his horse was gone under the wind. Jasper finally said quietly, "Silas." "What tax lien?" Silas's face had gone hard in a way Cordelia had not yet seen. "Father borrowed $340 from the Territorial Bank the year before he died. I have been paying it down. There was $280 still on it in the fall. I knew it. I thought we had until summer. He bought the paper. He bought the paper." Rowan, who had come out of the house behind them halfway through the conversation and had said nothing until now, said only very quietly, "He will not wait until March." "No," said Silas, "he will not." The wind moved in the pines. The sky over the Bitterroot had gone the colour of old pewter. Christmas was tomorrow. Cordelia Pemberton stood on that porch with a forged letter from Baltimore in one hand and the 3 men she had come to love in 3 different ways standing around her, and she understood that the storm she had weathered in November had not been the real storm at all. The real storm had a name, and the name was Ezra Blackwood, and the real storm was coming down the mountain for all 4 of them. Christmas morning came quiet. The wind had fallen off in the dark. The valley lay under a fresh blue stillness, and the smoke from the 3 Crowns chimney rose straight up into a sky so clean it hurt to look at. Cordelia woke before the light. She lay for a long moment under Charlotte Thornfield's log cabin quilt, and she listened to the house. Someone was already in the kitchen. She heard the soft iron music of a stove lid being lifted and set down again. She heard the creak of a floorboard near the pantry. She heard very faintly someone whistling a carol she did not know. It was Jasper. It was always Jasper at that hour. She dressed in the warmest of the 3 wool dresses she had made over since October. She pinned her honey-coloured hair up in the simple way she had learned to do for cold weather, with the soft, loose pieces that escaped anyway at her temples. She went down the narrow stair. The kitchen smelled of coffee and of something sweeter. Jasper turned from the stove with flour on his forearms and smiled at her. He had been baking. Miss Pemberton. Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas, Jasper. What are you making? A small cake. My mother's receipt. It was a tradition of hers. I have not made it since she died. I thought it was time. She crossed to him and she took down the crock of dried apples without being asked, and they worked together in the small warm kitchen while the sun came up on the 25th of December 1878. And for a few hours before the worst day of her life arrived, Cordelia Pemberton was simply happy. They had their Christmas supper at noon. Jasper had killed a wild turkey the week before and had hung it in the smokehouse. He served it on the pewter plates that had been his mother's. There was bread and apple cake and a jug of dark cider that Rowan had pressed in October. Silas said a grace that was short and plain and honest. He thanked God for the health of his brothers, for the safety of the stock, and for Miss Cordelia Pemberton, who he said had walked into their house as a stranger and become in 10 weeks the heart of it. She could not look at him when he said that. She looked at her plate. Rowan was the one who spoke next. He set down his cup, and he reached into the inner pocket of his flannel shirt, and he drew out a small object wrapped in a scrap of soft deer hide. Miss Pemberton, this is not a proper gift, but I made it. He set it on the pine table in front of her, and he sat back quickly as if the effort of giving it had cost him something he did not wish to show. She unwrapped the deer hide. It was a comb, a hair comb carved from a single piece of pale pine, and carved along its back were 2 small wild asters, the kind of aster that had been the last thing blooming at the base of Millicent Ashby's fence post, the kind she had laid on Millicent's grave in October. He had remembered. She did not have a voice for a moment. She ran her thumb along the carving. She looked up at him. Rowan Thornfield, this is beautiful. His mouth moved in a small, almost smile, and he said, looking at his plate and not at her, "It is nothing, Miss Pemberton." It was not nothing. They all knew it was not nothing. Silas said nothing, but his grey-going on silver eyes moved from Rowan to Cordelia and back again, and something in them gentled. And Cordelia understood in that moment that Silas had already seen what Rowan was keeping carefully hidden, and that Silas, being the man he was not going to begrudge his brother a small piece of pine. They did not yet know that they had perhaps 2 hours left before the trouble began. They had finished the meal, and Cordelia was putting the plates into the basin when Rowan, who had gone out to the porch to smoke, came back in fast through the kitchen door. He did not need to say anything. Silas was on his feet before Rowan had drawn breath. Riders, 4, coming down the north trail. Silas crossed to the window. Jasper crossed to the rack by the door where the rifles hung. Cordelia, without being told, moved to the pine table and began to stack the pewter plates. She did not know why she did it. She only knew that she did not want Charlotte Thornfield's plates to be in harm's way. Not Blackwood, said Silas at the window. Or not only Blackwood. That is 4 men. 2 I do not know. 1 has a rifle across the saddle. Rowan was already at the rifle rack beside Jasper. He took down the Winchester he preferred. He levered it open, checked the chamber, eased it closed. Cordelia said Silas and he did not turn from the window. Go upstairs, lock the door. Do not come down no matter what you hear until one of us 3 calls you by name. Silas, please. She went. She did not run. She went up the narrow stair with her skirt gathered in her free hand, and she walked into the large bedroom, and she turned the iron key in the lock. She went to the small chest under the window where Rowan had 3 weeks before shown her how to load and care for a small caliber pocket pistol that had been his grandfather's. She took the pistol out of the chest. She loaded it the way he had shown her. She did not sit. She stood beside the door, pistol in both hands, pointed at the floor, and she listened. She heard the horses come into the yard. She heard a voice she did not know call out from the yard. She heard Silas answer from the porch, his voice level, carrying, "That is far enough, gentlemen. State your business." Warrant for the arrest of Silas Thornfield. signed by Judge Horace Thurgood, violation of contract on a standing tax lien. You are not a lawman of any office I recognize. We are acting as deputies under authority of the Court of Silver Creek. Silver Creek is not a jurisdiction that reaches this property, and Judge Thurgood does not sign a warrant a federal judge would honor. Turn your horses and ride back down the mountain. A second voice, smoother, colder. Cordelia knew the second voice. Ezra Blackwood. Mr. Thornfield, please, let us not be unreasonable on a holiday. There is also the matter of Miss Pemberton, who is to accompany me back to Silver Creek this afternoon for her own protection. Her family in Baltimore is most anxious. Silas did not answer that. Cordelia heard instead the unmistakable metallic sound of a Winchester being levered. That was Rowan. She heard Silas's voice, then softer now, with something in it she had never heard before. The quiet of a man who has made a decision he will not take back. Mr. Blackwood, ride off this land. A horse moved. A saddle creaked. Cordelia heard the voice of the first man again, the one who had claimed to be a deputy, and now his voice had an edge to it. Thornfield, put that rifle down, or so help me, we will have to take you in by force. It did not happen the way she had imagined it in the long seconds before it happened. It happened all at once. She heard a shot from the yard. She did not know yet whose. She heard a shout. She heard Silas's voice, hard and carrying, shouting a name. She heard a second shot, and a third, and then a full uneven volley of them, 4 or 5 rifles answering each other, and the sound bouncing off the barn and off the ridge. She heard the deep bark of a large dog. She heard one of the horses scream. She heard a 4th shot, then a 5th, then silence that lasted perhaps 3 heartbeats. Then she heard Rowan say very clearly from the yard, "I am hit." She did not remember opening the door. She did not remember going down the stairs. She was in the kitchen, pistol still in her hand, and she was crossing to the porch door when Silas met her coming in, and he took her by the shoulders and turned her around, his face pale under the weather brown. "Cordelia, not yet. Rowan is down. Jasper is bringing him in. Blackwood is gone. He broke for the trees. 2 of the others are down in the yard. I do not yet know if they are dead. I need you to get water heating. Now." She moved. Her hands were moving before her mind caught up. Jasper came through the door carrying Rowan, the way Silas had carried him in the November storm. Rowan was conscious this time. His left trouser leg was dark almost to the knee with blood. His face was grey. "Put him on the table," said Cordelia, sweeping the pewter plates aside with one arm. Jasper cut the trouser, Silas the kettle. They worked. She did not let herself think. She did what needed doing, and when she reached for the bullet in Rowan's thigh with the long, thin pair of pincers Silas had boiled in the kettle, her hand did not shake. She did not know where that steadiness came from. She would later suspect it came from her father, who had always said that a Pemberton did not fall apart when a Pemberton was needed. The bullet came out clean. The wound was deep, but the artery was untouched. She packed it with the last of Jasper's clean muslin, the same muslin he had been saving. For some reason, none of them had ever asked since the year his Winifred died. Rowan did not cry out during any of it. He only lay with his jaw set and his amber eyes fixed on a single knot in the rafter above him, and once when Cordelia whispered an apology for the pain she was causing him, he whispered back, "You are not hurting me, Miss Pemberton. You are saving me. There is a difference." By 3 that afternoon, Rowan was in his own bed behind the kitchen. His colour was coming back. Silas had gone out into the yard. There were 2 men there. One was dead. One was alive, but not going anywhere on his own, with a wound in his shoulder that Silas bound with the quick, rough competence of a man who had bound such wounds before in Virginia and did not enjoy remembering it. Blackwood and the 4th man had gone up the trail into the timber, their horses gone with them. Silas did not pursue. Silas had a brother in the house who needed him more. They stood in the kitchen, Silas and Jasper and Cordelia, at perhaps 4 in the afternoon on Christmas Day, 1878, and they looked at each other across the pine table where so much had happened already, and Silas said, slow and tired, "This is not over." "No," said Jasper. "Blackwood will not come back himself, But he will send word, he will use Thurgood, he will use the lien. By the 15th of March, if we have not found a way out of this, we lose 3 crowns. And if we lose 3 crowns, we lose Cordelia too, because there will be no house for her to stay in. Cordelia opened her mouth. Silas held up a hand. Cordelia, listen to me. I will not have you marry any one of us because a banker in Silver Creek has made it the only way for you to keep a roof. That is not how a Thornfield takes a wife. Whatever you decide about this house, you will decide it free. If the house falls, we walk off it in the spring, all 4 of us with our heads up. I would sooner see 3 crowns go back to the mountain than see you choose it for any reason but the true one. She looked at him. She looked at Jasper. She looked toward the small back room where Rowan was sleeping off the morphine Jasper had given him from the little tin box his mother had once used. She put her hands flat on the pine table. Palms down, fingers spread the way. She had seen Silas put his hands on it the first night she had come into this house. It surprised her to find that her hands, which had pulled a bullet out of a man 4 hours before, still did not shake. Silas, she said, I would like to go upstairs for a moment. Alone. I will come back down. When I come back down, I will have something to say. He nodded once. He did not ask her what. She went upstairs. She sat on the edge of Charlotte Thornfield's quilt. She opened the small carved wooden box her father had given her for her 16th birthday, the one thing the creditors had not taken because it was already in her trunk at school when they came. Inside the box lay everything she had left of her family, her mother's cameo brooch, a small pair of pearl earrings, a thin gold chain, her grandmother's green stone ring set in a plain gold band, the last piece of the Pemberton women, which had gone from her great-grandmother to her grandmother to her mother, and on the day her mother died in the birthing bed, to the father who had saved it for his daughter. She took the ring out. She held it in her palm a moment. Then she closed her hand around it and she went back down the stairs. Silas and Jasper were still at the table. They stood when she came in. She went to Silas. She opened her hand flat in front of him. The cameo lay there, and the pearls and the chain and the small green stone ring. This, she said, is my inheritance. This is the whole of what the Pemberton family has left to give me. I would like you to take it to Helena. Sell the cameo. Sell the pearls. Sell the chain. Do not sell the ring. The rest will not cover $280, but it will come near, and it will buy a lawyer in Helena who can take our case above Judge Thurgood. And that is how we are going to keep this house. Silas looked at the small pile in her palm as if she had set fire to the table. Cordelia, I cannot. Silas Thornfield, she said, and she was astonished at how calm her own voice was. If you refuse this, I will take it to Helena myself on the next stage out of Hollow Pine. I have watched you for 10 weeks give everything to this house without asking anyone to give back. You once told me that work is the only honest currency on this mountain. This, she closed her hand and then opened it again, is my work. It is not charity, and it is not a bribe. It is a Pemberton paying her share of what she loves. She paused. Her voice did not quite break, but it came near to it. I am choosing this house, Silas. I am choosing it not because the house is about to be taken, but because if I do not help to save it, I will never forgive myself. Do you understand what I am saying to you? He understood her. She saw it move across his face. She had never in her life seen a man cry. Silas Thornfield did not cry now either. But something passed through his eyes that came close, and he lowered his head. And after a long moment he reached out with his right hand, the hand that had taken the frostbite in November and had never quite warmed through again. And he took the cameo and the pearls and the chain out of her palm. He did not take the ring. He closed her fingers over the ring with his own fingers, and he said in a voice very low, the ring stays in this house. I may need it myself before winter is out. She did not trust herself to answer that. She nodded. Silas Thornfield left for Helena the morning after Christmas. Jasper rode with him. Rowan stayed because Rowan could not ride. The 2 brothers took 2 of the best horses, the jewelry, and a leather pouch inside Silas's shirt, and 1 letter of introduction from the old judge up at Hollow Pine, who had known Jedediah Thornfield before the war, and who still owed the Thornfield family a favour from 1861. They were gone 19 days. Cordelia and Rowan and the Harrisons, who had moved over from their ranch the day after the shooting and bedded down in the bunkhouse so that the home place would not be defended by two people alone, made a small fortress of 3 crowns through the coldest part of January. Old Mr. Harrison slept by the fire with his rifle across his knees. His boy Jacob kept the barn. Cordelia nursed Rowan in the mornings and did the kitchen in the afternoons, and read aloud from the Austen novel in the evenings, and Rowan, healing, listened with his eyes closed, and sometimes, when he thought she was not looking, watched her instead of the fire. On the 18th of January, Silas and Jasper came home. They came in at dusk. They were thinner than when they had left, and harder faced, and Silas was carrying an envelope inside his coat that bore the seal of a federal judge named Cornelius Ashcroft. The lawyer and Helena had been worth every dollar of the cameo and the pearls and the chain. He had taken the matter directly to Judge Ashcroft. Judge Ashcroft, as it turned out, had already opened a quiet inquiry of his own into Ezra Blackwood, who had attempted the same scheme on no fewer than 8 other ranches across southern Montana Territory. Ashcroft was, in his own careful words, delighted to have a clean live witness and a clean live victim. He had issued federal warrants for Blackwood and for Judge Horace Thurgood within the week. By the time Silas and Jasper rode out of Helena, federal marshals had already taken Thurgood off his own bench in Silver Creek, and Blackwood himself had been arrested at a boarding house in Butte, trying to buy a railway ticket east. The tax lien on 3 crowns had been suspended. Judge Ashcroft had granted the Thornfield family 18 months to pay the $280 in full to the territory of Montana directly, not to any bank, not to any buyer, to the territory. 3 crowns was safe. They stood that evening in the kitchen, all 4 of them, with the fire high and the last of the dark cider warming in a pot on the stove. Silas told them the whole of what had happened in Helena. Jasper filled in the small, quiet pieces Silas in his way left out. Rowan, propped in the rocking chair by the hearth, with his leg in a splint, listened in silence and asked at the end only one question. Blackwood gets how many years? Ashcroft said 15. Good. And he closed his eyes. Cordelia sat at the pine table with her hands still curled around the Pemberton ring inside her apron pocket. She had kept it on her person since the day Silas had left. She had not once put it back in the wooden box. She looked at Silas across the table. He was already looking at her. The lamplight caught in his eyes and turned them for one short moment to old polished silver. Neither of them said anything. They did not need to. They were married on the 15th of April, 1879, at 3 Crowns Ranch. The pass had opened 3 days before. A circuit preacher out of Bozeman came up with the Harrisons. The Crowley family came from the west side of the valley, and their daughter Tessa, who was 20 that spring, stood beside Cordelia as her witness, and their eyes met during the vows in a way that none of them fully understood yet, but that Rowan, watching from the second row on his nearly healed leg, understood at once, and chose with the new quiet of a man who had been given back his life not to mind. Cordelia wore a dress of pale ivory wool that she and Mrs. Harrison had cut and sewn through the long second half of the winter. She carried a small handful of the first wild asters of spring found 2 mornings before by Rowan on the south slope. Her honey hair was pinned up with Rowan's pine-carved comb. On her left hand was the greenstone Pemberton ring. It had come at last to the daughter who would wear it for the rest of her life. Silas had no ring to give her in return. Silas had something better. He had written across the winter in the quiet hours after the Helena trip a page of plain words. He read it to her from memory in front of the preacher and the Harrisons and the Crowleys and Jasper, who was playing his mother's violin softly underneath, and Rowan, who was leaning on a hickory crutch and trying not to weep. Cordelia Pemberton, Silas said, I promise you this. I will be the husband of your days and the husband of your nights, the husband of your summers and the husband of your winters, the husband of your health and the husband of your sickness. I will build with you. I will work with you. I will bury with you, and I will raise with you. A man keeps his word. My word is yours. She answered him. She had not written down what she meant to say, and she had been afraid of the words not coming. They came. Silas Thornfield, I came to this mountain with nothing. I stand on it now with everything. I did not know in October that I was arriving home. I know it now. I will be your wife as long as you will have me, and if God is good, I will be your wife a long time. Jasper played the old Scottish air his mother had loved. The preacher pronounced them. Silas took her face in his two weather-roughened hands, and he kissed her once gently in front of everyone, and it was the first time his mouth had ever touched hers. That night he carried her, not over the threshold of the kitchen, but up the narrow stair to the large bedroom at the end of the hall, the room that had been Jedediah and Charlotte's, and that had been hers alone for 6 months, and that was now at last theirs. He set her on her feet inside the door. He turned to close it behind them. Outside the window, a late April snow was falling light as feathers, a last small gift from the bitter root. He turned back to his wife, and he closed the door. When morning came, the snow had already begun to melt, and everything was changed. The years came then. The years were good. She knew by the late summer that she was carrying his child. Silas knelt in the kitchen when she told him and laid his forehead against her apron, and he did not speak for a long time. Silas James Thornfield, the younger whom they called Jamie, was born on the 11th of June 1880, with Mrs. Harrison at the bedside, and Jasper in the kitchen, pacing, and Rowan out on the porch smoking, telling himself that he was not crying. Jamie had his father's grey eyes and his mother's honey hair, and he would grow to be the steady one as it turned out the way his father had been. Jasper married Prudence Whitaker in the late summer of 1881. She was a young widow school teacher at the new school in the growing town of Silver Creek, gentle and plain-faced and exactly right for him. They built their cabin 100 yards below the main house and raised 3 children of their own, and Jasper's violin, which had hung so long silent, was heard almost every evening for the rest of his life. Rowan took longer. Rowan took 4 years longer. He married Tessa Crowley from the west side of the valley in the summer of 1885 when he was 36 and she was 26, and the people of the valley said it had been worth the wait to see Rowan Thornfield smile at the altar. Tessa gave him 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, and the Thornfield brothers, 3 households, grew up together in the valley, ran their cattle together, buried their people together, and held every Thanksgiving supper from 1879 onward at the long pine table in the main house, where Cordelia, year on year, got up from her chair to light the lamps. Cordelia bore 3 more children after Jamie. Charlotte Elizabeth, in 1883, named for Silas's mother. Thomas Jasper, in 1885, named for her father and Jasper both. Caroline Grace, in the autumn of 1888, named for Silas's mother's mother, whose green ring Cordelia still wore on her left hand every day. Silver Creek became a town. A church was raised in 1884 on land the Thornfield family donated. A school was raised in 1887 on land the Thornfield family also donated, and Prudence was its first teacher. In 1890, Cordelia Thornfield was elected without having been asked and without having campaigned for it to chair the education committee of the town of Silver Creek. She served for 21 years. Jasper died quick and without warning of a heart that had always been more tender than he had let anyone know on the 4th of November, 1896. He was 48. Prudence did not remarry. She kept teaching. The violin that had been his grandmother's was hung again above the hearth in the main house, and was not played by anyone except Prudence, and only on Christmas Eve. The railroad came through the valley in 1902. The old stagecoach stop at Hollow Pine Crossing became a small train station. The weathered wooden sign that had stood there in October of 1878, the one Cordelia had stared at from a stagecoach window, with her heart in her mouth, was taken down by the Great Northern crew. Cordelia, sitting then, at the age of 46 on the porch of 3 Crowns, in the cool of an evening, wrote a letter to the station master and asked in her steady old copperplate if she might have the sign. It arrived 2 weeks later. Silas hung it over the main door of the barn, where it stayed for as long as there were thornfields on the place. In the October of 1908, on a morning with the first small snow already falling, Cordelia Thornfield stood at the rebuilt platform of what was now Silver Creek Station. Silas, 62, white-haired, a little stooped now in the shoulders from a life of work, stood beside her with his hat in his hand. They were meeting a train. Charlotte Elizabeth Thornfield, 25 years old and wearing a good travelling dress of dark green wool, stepped off the train first. Her husband, a young doctor she had met in Boston, stepped off behind her, and then their two small children, the boy and then the little girl, were handed down. The little girl was 4 years old. Her name was Delia Grace. She'd been named at her birth for a grandmother she had heard about in letters her whole life and was seeing now in the flesh for the first time. She looked up at Cordelia out of wide cornflower blue eyes. She said, "Because small children do say such things without warning, Grandma." "When did you come here first?" Cordelia Thornfield knelt. She did not kneel easily any more. She set her gloved hands gently on her granddaughter's shoulders. "I came here on a day just like this one, sweetheart. It was snowing. I did not have a home. I did not have any money. I did not have any hope. Were you sad? I thought I was," said Cordelia, "but I was wrong." Silas behind her stood looking out at the valley he had built and held. The first small flakes of a new winter were coming down on his broad shoulders. Cordelia lifted her granddaughter into her arms. She turned carefully with the weight of the child. She looked at Silas. Silas looked at her. She said so that only he could hear it, the thing that was in her heart. Silas, that day, when I stepped off the stage at Hollow Pine, I thought my life had ended. I remember, said Silas, but it had not ended, had it? No, my love, it had not ended. What had it done? He reached for her free hand. He held it. He looked at the little girl in her arms, and he looked past her at the long valley of 3 Crowns under its first new snow, and he said in the voice he had used to speak to her for 30 years, low and sure, and without hurry, "It had only begun, Cordelia. Winter always ends, but a love that is built with your own 2 hands does not end. It only begins." She did not answer that with any words. There were none left to say. She turned with her granddaughter still on her hip, and she walked with her husband up the long road toward 3 Crowns Ranch, and the snow came quietly down, and the mountain which had watched them from the first watched them still.